drawing detail, and I've called this session Light Touch Retrofit, which I think you'll see why. And we're going to look at the Slaughterhouse conversion project in Madrid by Arturo Franco and Fabrice van Teslar, who are architects from Madrid. Anybody familiar with this project? Good, perfect. I think it's a really interesting conversion. And I say light touch as kind of typified by this image. This is the entrance, and what you've got is this old brick building which was a slaughterhouse, and converted into exhibition space, gallery space, but they've done everything with the minimum. So basically, if they've not had to touch that existing building, they've left it alone. And then when they do add an element to that building, it touches very lightly, and I mean, it could be removed, but partly that's just the aesthetic they want. So if you look at the front door here, there's a ramp built over this sort of gutter, I don't know what you would call it really, and that's pretty much all they've done. The doorway is, I'm not sure, there's some very rough brickwork there, I'm not sure if they've slightly enlarged the opening. The tree here, they've just built the ramp around it, and then the main entrance, no it's not, it's the back entrance, looks like this, and again a very sort of light touch. They've put a steel reveal around the brickwork, and they have this steel deck just to get you into the building. And that's the kind of approach that they've taken throughout. Now, what you will notice, this is a building in Madrid. Obviously, Madrid has a very different climate to us, although it does get quite cold in the winter. So it's not a completely warm climate, and certainly when I was there, it was pretty cold. But you will see in the design that it's not really designed for a sort of temperate climate. It's for a much warmer climate they are designing for. This is not a very helpful site plan. This is a typical sort of detail site plan. But anyway, this is the main building in question. And if we just go into a more detailed view, that's the ramp entrance. That's the tree, which is in the ramp. It brings you into this main exhibition building. There's some toilets, and then there's a series of open exhibition gallery spaces. And the thing just to note here is this enclosure here is the only sort of really fully heated space in the building, and we're going to look at some of the detail of that, how they've built it. It's kind of like a box within a box type of architecture, just to allow that element to have a degree of environmental control. But just go back to the site. It's a much bigger complex, and most of the buildings have now been converted, so it's a very big development. And that's the kind of view inside, and as you can see, they've left as much alone as they can. So you've got all the old plasterwork exposed. This is concrete work. There appears to be some fire damage, so there's sort of evidence of smoke in there. Maybe there's been a fire at some point, but they've not made any effort to clean that up. And then when they have to make a bit of work on a doorway, for example, the language they've gone for is for a very sort of heavy steel aesthetic, often using a pre-patinated steel, a weathered steel, which already has a kind of rusted finish to it. Or I think sometimes they're just using mild steel, which they allow to then decay a little bit and to rust a bit. It's not going to rust too much because it's kept dry. Okay. That's another view inside. And what you can see here is we've got all the old ceiling work, the old columns, and one of these mild steel sheet insertions here, which I think in this case might just be creating an office inside. And then everything else very much left alone, exposed surfaces, and in this part of the building a new concrete floor. But the piece of the floor that we're going to look at today is actually a steel floor. And that's one of the exhibition spaces. in there. I mean, you can imagine it was probably quite a low-cost refurbishment as well with the approach. That's a kind of typical section. So that's the ramp entrance into this brick structure, which has a kind of a ceiling here, and there's a truss hidden away in there. And this is that box within a box that I mentioned, where they have a kind of raised floor, glass walls, and a ceiling to allow them to keep that environmentally controlled. That's a view of this box. So old crumbling plasterwork is just left. You know, maybe they've probably stabilized it a bit. They might have put a sort of a coating of glue on it just to stop it dusting away, but generally just left alone. In places they've hacked the plaster off at ground level. I guess if it was too crumbly, they just sort of hacked it off. But otherwise, they're not too fussed, and presumably they have to sweep. You know, they have to sweep the floor because it will get dust and plaster dropping off. I mean, it's a kind of similar approach that Scarpa was using on a number of projects, although often in Scarpa's case, the roughness would then be hidden over with a panel, so the piece that you touch would be smooth. Here, they're not bothered. They just let it all hang out. It's all dirty. If you touch it, you can touch it if you want. So we've got this full height glass wall, and you can just make out here that there's some very sort of substantial bits of steel work to hang that glass, and there's a gap above it. You just make out there's a complete air gap above this box, so it really is a box within a box, room within a room. And then the floor is slightly raised up, and it's got these kind of enormous steel doors, which are just big, thick sheets of steel. Very consistent with the aesthetic. And what we'll see, there's a lot of weight there. So if you imagine the weight of those steel beams, the weight of that glass hanging from it, the weight of that door, it's all pretty heavy. And you'll see in the detail how they've used the steel work to give it a really kind of robust support. And then that's one of the exhibition spaces. In this case, they've got a sort of panelled floor with I think this is an accessible floor where they can lift it to get to services. I guess so that they can, for exhibitions, they can run power up to exhibits. And in this instance, they've got exposed ventilation, galvanized ducts, and they're pumping in some warm air into that space. In the box that we're going to look at, the ventilation is actually above the soffit. If I just go back, you can just make out there are grills in the ceiling here. So what they've decided to do here is just hide that ductwork above the ceiling and just have grills to let that air in, compared to this approach where they're just exposing the ductwork. Okay, that's the same kind of space. Great, fantastic door opening, I thought there. It's a sort of 20mm thick steel frame to the door in mild steel with a bit of graphics, and they haven't even bothered repairing the gap, so it doesn't really even meet the wall, but it just sort of defines the route and makes sure that people walk in the correct place. And that's the view at the bottom. I mean, there's nothing to stop you walking around the side, of course. And then you can just see in here, this is our box, and this is the steel plank floor that we're going to look at in a little while. And very much consistent with this aesthetic, you make this little step. So there's a little step there, about 50mm, not a big step, into that space. In the UK, you wouldn't be allowed to do that, because you're not allowed single steps. Okay, you wouldn't be allowed to do it. You'd certainly have to put some sort of yellow hazard warning tape on that. But, I think what they're probably doing here is saying, well, I think, looking at the design of this door, we think people will notice that it's there. so they're probably not very likely to trip up on it. Okay. That's the toilets, where they have made virtually no effort to clean the walls up. They've just fixed mirrors and appliances directly to the existing brickwork with plaster on it. That's a view up, looking at the ductwork and the old soffit there. That's one of the concrete columns. I don't know what the history of this is, but you can see the concrete column at some point started out with quite a sort of smooth face to it, and these chamfered arrises, and then I don't know, over hundreds of years of use, I guess it's just been sort of bashed away, and and it's now has this got a sort of much more rough shape to it, which they just leave exposed. This is a steel floor at this point, and in this space they've got these little access channels, which again I think is probably to allow them to bring up cables for exhibits. And when it meets the column, there's just a little gap. There's no sort of attempt to try and seal that gap. That's a window, very heavy steel frame, toughened glass, and on this window they're not really trying to make it airtight, which, as I say, in Madrid you can just about get away with. It wouldn't really work in our climate. But it's kind of nice, I think, nice detail here that they didn't try and frame in a window into the brickwork. They just let it sort of overhang the window. That's the same window there, and then just looking up at the soffit. And same again. So if we'll go now and look at this box. Okay. So that's the kind of detail that we're going to look at. Looking at the soffit, looking at the floor, looking at the glass, the fixed glass partition, and then looking at the sliding glass partition. Okay. So today, I think the details today are fairly kind of simple. They're not dealing with water tightness. They're not particularly dealing with air tightness. So, quite a simple one. But I think a good detail showing a kind of a careful approach to an existing building. Any questions on the building before we do a bit of drawing? No? Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to cheat here for a moment. Might as well. I'm just going to draw the outline of the existing building. That'll save a bit of time. I mean, and I like the way they've drawn it here in Detail magazine. The everything which is existing, they've just drawn it as a sort of solid grey fill, because you're not really kind of interested with what is inside those walls. We're just interested in how we can fix to them. Okay. I'll just draw this outline. Yeah. Here. No, at the top, so there. No, that's just a downstand beam, an old one, and the glass is over here actually. Yeah. I think it's got timber. I think there's some timber structure up above your head, but you can't really see it. Okay, so there's our that's our outline of the existing. Just sticking that in a bit. Okay. Let's do this. Okay, so we'll start looking at the top, at the soffit. Okay, let's take that. So the first thing that they've done is to give a sort of solid support for all this steelwork up here. They've actually bedded a fairly substantial steel beam into the brickwork. And that looks something like this. So you've got a steel, I'm not sure if it's a universal beam or a channel, but basically what they've done is they must have drilled quite a big pocket into that brickwork there, and then they will have pushed this steelwork in, and they will have put a resin mix into that, probably injected it in, and that resin will cure very, very hard, and it will stick to the brickwork. So it's very strong structural resin, which then fixes this piece of steel very firmly into that wall. There don't appear to be any bolts on it, which is why I think they've not bolted it into the wall. They've not used resin anchors. I suspect they've just used a big pocket of resin in here. Okay, but that would all be engineers' work, of course, and the engineer would do all the calcs on that. And then what you typically do when you're working on an existing building like that is, once you've got that in place, you would put a test rig on it, which would do a pull-out force onto it. So they basically would get it on a scaffold. They get a test rig, which they can sort of crank up the load on it they would try and pull that beam out of the wall, and the engineer would have specified whatever 10 kilonewtons, and as long as it doesn't pull out, then everyone's happy. But it's quite a common technique just to be sure, because you're not 100% sure what that wall is made of. Okay, so a pull-out test is something to, if you're ever working with existing masonry, pull-out tests are very useful. Okay, so they've got that, and what they've then done, and it looks like it's welded on, is they've welded on a big steel channel onto this. And they're clearly sort of not making any efforts to slim down the steel work. I think they're probably quite happy for this to look quite heavy. Okay, just shade that in. Okay, so there's that. So that's giving a very very solid support point. What they've then got is a slightly lighter structure. Let's get that right in here. So they've got another angle in there, which is a bit smaller. Okay. Yeah, so that's on there, and then to hold it all together, it looks like what they've got is a little steel box section in here. Let's just zoom in on that. Yeah. So a little steel box in there. And then this smaller angle becomes the structure which holds up the ceiling. Something like that. Oops. Okay. And the gap here is the gap that they're using to hold this fixed glazing in place. So, without worrying too much about the glass spec, they've got laminated, 2 sheets of laminated glass. It looks like it's not double glazed, and maybe because it's Madrid they kind of think that's acceptable. But it's laminated, 2 sheets of glass with a laminated interlayer. That gives it the strength. It also means that if you break it, the lamination layer holds it in place so you don't get big bits of glass falling out. It will also be a safety glass, which means, like a car windscreen, when you break it, it breaks into little small pieces that that aren't dangerous. Okay, so it would be both. It would be toughened safety glass, and it's laminated, because obviously what you couldn't have with this is if somebody threw a brick at it and it broke, big sharp bits of glass that could injure somebody. Okay, that glass is just held in. Looks like there's a little rubber gasket pushed in there, just to hold it in place. Fairly kind of simple detail there. Okay, so what else have we got? They've got a little fluorescent tube here. In there, which is just fixed, probably just screwed into the steelwork, and I don't really remember it, to be honest, but I'm sure it gives quite a nice lighting effect, because you can't see the light bulb, but you probably get a lot of good light kind of bouncing down through this gap. And cheap as chips, very kind of clever, really. They're not gone to their client and said we need Louis Poulsen light fittings. We can just go to the Madrid B&Q, whatever that is, and buy some fluorescent tubes. Client's happy, architect's happy, so quite clever. Okay, then there's actually another kind of steel substructure here. So you've got some box sections. Okay, like that. And these are then hung from the soffit. So you've got steel cable coming up, and you can buy, there are sort of proprietary fixings that you can drill into the soffit there. Very strong. They have little cover plates to make it all nice and neat, so that the hole that you've drilled, you can cover that up. And the steel cable is on an adjustable system, so you can adjust that height. In Sheffield, we make gripples, which are fantastic little tensioning devices for steel cables, come in all sorts of sizes. Fantastic. They don't have those in Madrid, unfortunately, so I'm not sure what they use, but some system for adjusting steel cables. Okay. Because you're hanging this, you're not hanging the glass off it, because the glass is hanging off this big steel beam, but you're hanging a lot of that ceiling off it. But the steel cables are very, very strong. That's what this will be hung up with. This ceiling here will just have lots of little steel cables going into the concrete above, just to hang it. Okay. It's not, it wouldn't be that strong, but who's gonna walk on it? I'm not. Okay. Then they've just actually got simple plasterboard slotted in here, which I have to say slightly surprises me that they've gone with this sort of modular feel where everything's a component with an edge and a gap, and then they put a bit of standard sort of plasterboard with a skim coat up here. But cheap I suppose, but that's what they've done. And then what it looks like they've done actually is just lay insulation above it in here. Okay. Okay, so insulation above there just to give it some thermal performance. I mean, as you can probably see, there's lots of cold bridging on this detail, but I think in the climate that's probably okay. And they're not going to get condensation because it's a well ventilated space. So probably fair enough. What they're not really showing, but we know that it's there because we saw it, is there's ductwork up here. So they've got galvanized ventilation ductwork up here, and at certain points that comes down and that will have a hood which feeds into a little grill in the plasterboard to allow that air into the space. And then out of sight, that ductwork can kind of do what it wants. Okay, so that's the detail at the soffit. Anybody got any questions or comments on that? No? It's all fairly straightforward, isn't it? But I think it's one of these details where it looks really simple because they've made some really clever decisions. Whereas, imagine if you'd not, for example, made this clear decision to separate the ceiling from the walls, and you were trying to kind of join a new ceiling with this old crumbly wall, and then you're asking your painters to come in and paint along that edge, and they're getting paint all over the brickwork, or they're saying, well, we need a coving here, or we need some shadow gap, we need some junction. So there's a clever sort of deliberate separation here. And then equally, I think with the glass, rather than glazing in the window, just stepping it back gives a much kind of, in a way, kind of cleaner aesthetic. Okay, let's look at the detail at the bottom of that. Okay. So, let me just get my glass in the right place here. That's the glass. I mean, one thing I was sort of hoping from these sessions as well is just that you sort of, this idea that you can construct drawings quite quickly, which is why sometimes I do leave you sat there while I'm sat drawing lots of insulation or getting my grey pen because that'll make it look nice. But just to give you that kind of feel that if you really rush it, it's not good enough to use. If you just put a little bit more time in, then you end up with a detail where you may say, yeah, that'll go in my technology report, or that goes on my CMA. Just for a little bit more care with your sort of line work. Okay, back to the bottom. Right, so what they've done here is, unfortunately I've drawn the floor a bit wonky there, but never mind. They've bedded in, it's kind of odd one this, but they've bedded into the floor some steel channels. Now, I'm assuming that floor underneath there has some kind of screed finish, although we're not showing it here because we're just drawing a thick line, but I'm assuming that this is a kind of softer screeded finish, which means that it's very easy to get a saw and cut some slots in it. So what they've done is, it looks like they've cut some slots to get these channels in. I mean, what they might have actually done is, if that's the existing floor, they may have just cut a big slot in it like that. Then position the steel in place like that, and then fill the gap either with resin or with grout. I don't know, but that would be a sort of sensible way to do it, just to make an oversized hole, get your steel work in, and fill around it, and that'll be really solid, really strong once it's finished. Okay. As I'm sure you're aware, Detail Magazine, they don't always show you the full detail. It's kind of an approximation. Okay, anyway, they've got these channels bedded in the floor. And there are a few of those. And those channels are then supporting the floor, and they're also holding the glass in place. So the detail at the edge here is fairly similar to the top, where again they've used these back-to-back angles, kind of like this. So two back-to-back steel channels, which again look like they're welded to that channel that's in the floor. The glass then, like at the top, comes down the middle. And sits on a packer at the bottom. And the way they show it, which surprises me to be honest, they show it sealed in right at the bottom, but for a start, I don't know how you would actually get that sealant down there. And secondly, if you dropped anything in that gap, it would just fill up with rubbish. So I suspect that is up there, but I could be wrong. Okay, and that's our laminated glass again. That's the glazing dealt with. And for the floor, what they've done is they've put another steel box spanning across like this. And on top of that is just a mild steel plate, which is welded on. And that's what you walk on. Okay. Like that. And then that little service channel that I mentioned is in the middle here. I haven't drawn that quite right, but there's a little steel angle. That should stop there, and that should continue on like that. So there's a little steel angle there, which supports this removable plate here, which sits on another angle, which sits on another steel bedded in the floor. And underneath that, they've got a wiring zone or a pipework zone in there. Yeah, so that's the detail at the bottom. Really kind of simple, I think. I mean, I really like it. And when I went there, what's lovely is when you step onto it, it's got this sort of tactile, resonant feel about it. It makes a noise and it vibrates a little bit because it's made of steel. It's really nice. Any questions on that? Straightforward? Good. Okay. So I'm going to now just quickly look at we'll look at the plank floor, and tell you what we'll do. We'll just very quickly look at the sliding mechanism, which I'm not going to redraw because it's so similar to the one that we've got, actually. So I'm just going to draw it over the top here. Okay. So they've got the same kind of steelwork arrangement, fixed back to the wall as before. This is all identical. They've got the same fixed glazing zone as before. And obviously at the moment where there's an opening, that glass is omitted, but when you're at the sides of the sliding door, you've got a condition where you've got glass with glass door slid over the front. And that's actually the bit that we're drawing. And then all they've done is they've used a sliding channel which they fixed to the underside of this inner steel like this. And that's a kind of proprietary system which will have wheels in it and ball bearing races, just a bit of mechanical equipment basically. And that hangs down like that. And then in that they hang the glazed door. So it's just something like that. So that's the glazed door. That's the sliding door, sorry. Very, very simple. And at the bottom, what they've done is quite as clear actually. At the bottom, what they appear to have done is it's not entirely clear, but they've left a slot in the floor, and they seem to have omitted this steel channel at that moment. So the sliding door comes down, sits in that slot, And then there's just a little bit of a little gap there before the glazing starts again. Just pull that to the side. So it's not quite such an elegant detail at the bottom, but they seem to have managed to just slot that sliding track in adjacent to the glazing. It's not entirely clear, but what they've done is, I haven't drawn it quite right. They've fitted in a little steel box in there just to hold the edge of that glass in place before that channel. Okay. So we'll just quickly look at this steel plank floor, and then that's it. Okay. So there's our floor. Steel channel. Just a minute. Right, channel in the floor as before. 2 back-to-back steel channels. And the glass coming through the middle. And then this one's kind of really simple detail, where they've bedded into the floor. They've put steel channel running across, like that, which just stops about flush with the floor. And then what they will have done is they will have got that steel work completely leveled. So they'll have packed that to make sure that is completely level. That allows them then just to fix in place with a little spot weld every now and then a series of steel channels like this. So that's all they've done. They've just spot welded those in place, and that creates the floor. And because they've got everything perfectly level, you've not got sort of unevenness between these planks. I'm just going to go quickly back into the slides, and then we're done. But just to have a quick look at some of the images that we've now drawn. So it's a bit small there, but you can just make out the plank floor there and the relationship with the glass. I'll just go back a few. That's that kind of steel frame at the floor and the slightly thicker steel frame at the top. That's the steel beam bedded into the wall, and I don't quite know why, but they did it at 45 degrees. I'm not sure at all why, but anyway. Ventilation grills. This is the plasterboard soffit you can see there, and that's a kind of different space. It's probably done. That's the different floor, which is not the it's not the steel planks, not the channels, but it's the sheets. sheets of steel fixed to those bearing rails, and that's our little servicing zone. Okay, I do. Anybody got any questions? Yeah. Yeah, good question. Well, I suppose if it's not obvious, no, can't see an obvious way. I mean, well, it might be. I mean, it might be that where I'm assuming welded connections, you know, if that inner piece of steel was actually was bolted into this box connection. So if this was all a bolted assembly, then I suppose you could undo that inner piece of steel. I mean, in reality, this will be super strong glass, but yeah, I don't know. Good question. Oh, the other thing, oh yeah, I was going to ask you, there was a little quiz question. Do you think there's anything there that you probably wouldn't get away with in the UK? What, yes, good one. I mean, the other thing I thought, you might get away with it, is there's no manifestation on the glass. I mean, in the UK, we're a bit obsessed. You have to mark, you have to put little dots on the glass. Now, you can argue, even in the UK, you can argue that as long as the frame is substantial enough that people will be aware that there's glass there and not run into it. But, I mean, that's why it's there, because if people run through glass, it's horrendous. I don't know, you might get away with that in the UK. When I saw it, I thought, no manifestation. But yeah, no door handle. Yeah. Don't know how you meant to open it. They'll probably leave it open all the time. Yeah. Okay. If you're in Madrid, go and have a look though. It's a fantastic project. I thought it was really excellent.